You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Malfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelist Christopher Zender. Our welcome guest is Sean Domencic. We have today an interesting topic. It's a new development in the Catholic worker tradition. Sean is the director and co-founder of Tradistae. He's written extensively, spoken extensively about Catholic social teaching, economics, and politics, and the three go together. He and his wife, Monica, recently celebrated their first wedding anniversary. Congratulations. They live at a Holy Family Holy Family Catholic Worker in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. As always, we'll begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, granted by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, to get started, Sean, could you please tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. You mentioned, that I spoke and wrote extensively, and I hope that has a grain of truth to it. But I'm fairly new to all this. But as background for myself, I am a member of the Catholic Worker Movement. I live at Holy Family Catholic Worker, which was founded only just over a year ago. So a fairly young Catholic worker house. And for a few years now, I've been doing the Tradistae podcast, as well as the website and other resources and organizing that we've been doing. And my main sort of hope and goal and something that's guided and inspired me in these past few years really has just been the vision of Catholic social teaching. And wanting to try to share that. So it's a lot of different angles I could go down, but I'm happy to answer any other questions on that.
Well, Christopher, have him go down an angle.
Okay, well, the name of your group is Tradistae, and you're a Catholic worker house. The root of that word Tradistae, in Catholic worker, people often don't put those two things together. Can you maybe explain your name, the name of the organization, what it's about, and how it fits into the Catholic worker tradition, and is yet, shall we say, traditional?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right that a lot of people don't. I mean, many people don't even know what the Catholic worker is. But I'll trust listeners to do some independent research if it's the first time they've heard of it. But for those who do, they often don't associate. They kind of think Catholic worker means maybe unorthodox or left wing Catholicism, and that traditionalist means far right and very rigidly Orthodox Catholicism. And the word, like you said, Tradistae, it's rooted in that word tradition, that handing down. And I think for myself coming into it, although I certainly recognize the way in which people don't see them going together, like when they look around in the world, they see a lot of maybe traditionalists who are very opposed to the sort of social justice ideas that are in the Catholic worker, or on the other hand, they see Catholic workers and stuff who are promoting social justice, but are extremely opposed to tradition and traditional doctrines and stuff. When I was encountering these ideas, they kind of went hand in hand for me. I had certain people in my life who were very inspired by both of those things. And I was reading various sources and just seeing the way that they really mesh together. And then, when I was encountering Dorothy Day and Peter Marin, the co-founders of the Catholic Worker, I found them, I found them through their writings primarily, and found that they were really traditionalists in many ways. They were Dorothy, references so often all of these traditional documents, traditional ways of prayer, and just a very, what we would, think of or call a very traditional spirituality in many ways, that was at the same time intimately connected to this vision of social justice, of Catholic social teaching, et cetera. And so, I think for myself, I always just kind of saw how they went hand in hand, and, not because of anything special about me, just because the things that I encountered, I didn't really kind of get caught up in either like of the versions where they're made to oppose each other. And having been really inspired by that vision that I've received, my hope is to share that with others. And obviously it's also what we try to live out here at our own Catholic Worker House.
Okay, add on to that, another question. When you use the term traditionalist, I think it's gotten different meanings. How is being a traditionalist being different from being just a Catholic?
Sure. Yeah. And of course, in some ways, we don't really need to, like, we should be able to, it's not like we should be divided into camps in the church and everything. But I think there is a beauty and a value, I think, to, recognizing like what's really good about traditionalism without being like, making that like a camp that's opposed to other things in the church. And I'd say that the key idea there, that like the word tradition, right, means, comes from traditio, like handing down. It means receiving what's passed down. And I think we've seen in the church a lot of, just people falling away from those roots, not accepting the things that have been passed down in the church. And so there's a need to kind of reground ourselves in those roots. But what's really funny is that, that traditional aspect kind of goes hand in hand with another word that I would also identify with, which is the idea of being a radical. And people often think, when people say radical, it often has a sort of left-wing connotation, someone who's maybe trying to disrupt the system or change things. But something that Peter Marin, co-founder of the Catholic Worker, loved to point out is that the word radical has very similar meaning to traditional, because the word radical comes from the word radix or root. And so it means being rooted, it means going back to the roots of things. And we find that in our world, which has fallen very far away from the faith, from God, to be a traditionalist, to believe in these ancient traditions of the church, of God, of what our Lord has passed down, is also to be a radical, is to be very opposed to, the sort of status quo in many ways of our society. And so, yeah, that's maybe a one way of just looking at those words in their original meaning.
A couple of thoughts. First would be St. John Chrysostom, whose liturgy is the central liturgy of the Russian Greek Church, was in his life as close to a Catholic worker as anybody could imagine. So here we have this beautiful, developed, awesome liturgy. And I don't use the word awesome lightly because it's so horribly overused. But we have this powerful liturgy. And then when we look to St. John Chrysostom, he really preaches the Sermon on the Mount. He really preaches nonviolence. He really preaches hospitality. And he really challenges the rich. Chrysostom, Golden Tongue, in one of his sermons, he says, this is a paraphrase, but pretty accurate. He says, I know a lot of you are really here to watch the races at the track, but since you have a little extra time, you've decided to hear a preacher preach. Well, let me tell you what I think. And he just is devastating, scathing in his criticism of the kind of life that these religious tourists lived. And like so many of the Greek fathers, he found himself in trouble with this emperor and that empress over and over again. So this notion that there has to be some split between what we might loosely refer to as the traditional and what we refer to as the activist dimension of the faith, that is so mistaken. But it's always, I think, been present. I came into street protests mostly via the United Farm Workers and Huelga, the strike, and Las Uvas, boycotting of grapes. And of course, Cesar Chavez and Dorothy Day were close, good friends. But so many people don't realize even the history of the farm workers. I mean, they maybe read John Steinbeck and I guess this has been going on for quite a while. And it has, just in more or less contemporary American history. And I don't mean to be a shock jock, but at the Catholic Worker in, what year was it? 68. It's a whole group of workers, so to speak, that had their own magazine. And when Dorothy got a hold of the copy of the magazine, she kicked them all out. And what was the name of the magazine? FU, Magazine of the Arts. It was being published by people of the Catholic Worker. Well, as soon as she saw it, they were history. So there's this tension. And if I had to refer it more specifically to the Catholic Worker, I'd say there's a kind of an Ammon Hennessy wing. And then there's a kind of Peter Morin wing. And Peter Morin went so far as to say, strikes don't strike me. Whereas Ammon Hennessy proclaimed himself in egomaniacal fashion a one-man revolution. That's not solidarity, really. That's I don't know what a radical egoism. But having said that, I think each of us individually has these tensions within our own lives as well. So they get writ large. And I'm glad to see it. You could perhaps tell us more about the equilibrium between theory and practice and how each enriches the other.
Sure. Yeah. No, and there's a lot of, those tensions definitely. I mean, Dorothy was a friend of both Eamon and Peter in the Catholic worker movement. And those tensions, have always been there. And I think in the modern era are definitely very strong. But I think there is a real way that certainly is exemplified in a lot of the Catholic worker movement, and also just in other places, either in the history of the Catholic Church or in, more recent developments in how to sort of live that out well, where rather than being kind of, pulled too far one way or the other, or even just having like an uncomfortable mix between the two, being able to really integrate those. But you were asking about, that idea of sort of theory and praxis and everything, and maybe brings me around to something that's really important to what Tradistae is trying to do. And it kind of goes back to a vision of Peter Marin's, which is that, to bring about a change in our society that brings, society closer to God, that it makes a world where, as Peter said, it's easier for people to be good. What we need is a sort of clear understanding of the problems. We need a clear understanding of how the world is, and then also how the world should be and how to get there. So that kind of, exists on the theoretical level. And then we also need to put that into action. Like both of those things, are really important. And unfortunately, what you often see is that there's a lot of, among Catholics who are very engaged with these ideas, there's very little praxis. There's very little action. So, there's a lot of people who have written great books on these topics, critiquing modernity or about, social teaching or whatever else, 1,000 different sort of issues within social teaching. And I don't want to say that those resources are bad in any way. I draw from a lot of them. But the need that I've just seen is that those are, often not really boiled down for people, but especially people who maybe aren't as able to, read through a 300-page book or don't have the time for that kind of thing. So one of the key goals is easy essays on Tradistae, which is boiling down some of these big concepts that we talk about with Catholic social teaching into 500-word essays, real short, something that you can read in a few minutes, something that can be printed on a little pamphlet, and just give people a general sense of those ideas. Also, obviously, a goal with our podcast and resources like those. And then, on top of that, I don't just want to get these ideas out there, but I want to really encourage people to put them into action. To begin living out these ideas and values, and really looking towards what Jesus demands in the gospel and what the church is calling on us all to do through the chair of Peter, through what the magisterium is calling on us to do, and really to put that out and put that into practice in a radical way. And I do truly believe that if all Catholics were to live the way that Christ was calling us to, then we'd be changing the world, right? Like it wouldn't be a question of how do we do this, how do we make this or that happen, but it would just be happening all around us if every Catholic were living out the faith as they were called to.
Indeed. With regard to easy essays, there's an expression in retail politics. Be ready with your elevator pitch. So, for example, if you mention the American Solidarity Party and you're on the elevator, what will you say in the 2 minutes left? Now, back in the 60s and the 50s, young Catholic workers would get on elevators on Wall Street. And the elevators were slower in those days than they are now. And one would begin with something like, your dollar is your best friend. And then they go into back and forth reciting an easy essay by Peter Morin, maybe shouting with the Rotarians or something like that. So that was pre-street theater. And it was done by Catholic workers on elevators who were very intent on getting into the public. But I don't know if you want to try that. The elevators are faster.
That's true, but definitely, that's an important, that idea in general is something that obviously there's a lot of Catholic worker houses that are involved in similar sort of actions and stuff, and something that we've tried to do with Tradistae is definitely to be a presence at some of the protests and events, whether they're the pro-life events or environmental events or racial justice events or whatever else, and trying to present that unique Catholic vision that often many Catholics even don't know exists. So definitely trying to get those ideas out there is something that we try to continue the tradition of.
Now, Christopher tries to get those ideas out as a member of his city council. Yeah, that's a very different way of advancing things. Christopher, what next should we ask this young gentleman?
I was going to say about it's hard to get those ideas off many times in your member of village council, because it's mostly what you're dealing with are questions of how to move water from one place to another. Sewer systems loom large in local politics, so it's almost it's a kind of a janitorial function, I suppose. But yeah, talking about praxis and what to do, it's something I've thought a lot about over the years. When I was younger, I used to think we got to do more, and the older I get, it seems like there's not as much to do, not because there's not a lot of things that need to be done, but when you're raising a family, when you have a regular job, besides just making a good example and saying things every now and again, what do you do? I mean, how do you take your life and try and make it a more radical expression of the gospel of Christ? Mm-hmm. It's easy sometimes to say, well, you all should be doing more out there, but then they look at you and they say, well, what in the hell do you want us to do, right? Mm-hmm. I'm raising my children, I'm homeschooling, I have 7, 8, 9 of them. I have a job that I'm working, sometimes working 2 jobs in order to raise this family. What do I do? Sure.
Yeah, no, and I think that's it's a really important question for people in our day, because maybe back in the day, back even in 100 years ago or something, the landscape of things looked so differently. And now, we look around at the world, and it really does seem like, from a Christian point of view, it's like, where do I even start? Like, how could I possibly begin to do anything about this kind of collapsing world that we live in? And I think something really important to begin with is that it's not something that what can feel overwhelming is exactly what you mentioned. For families, if you're raising kids, if you're working jobs, if you're struggling to pay the bills and all that, that's hard to do, right? But something that a Bruderhof friend once told me is that the Sermon on the Mount wasn't directed in the second person singular. It wasn't you in the singular, but the second person plural. It's you as in you guys, as in you people. This people, this ecclesia that I'm calling out, this church. And so recognizing that community element, I think, is really what frees us into real sort of action, right? Like, there's no way that I would be able, I'm married. I don't have any children yet. But just the daily things that go on in life, I wouldn't be able to do the simple kind of works of mercy that we do here at the house without the community of support. And it's not a huge community. It's only a few other, members that live with us and everything. But just, really intentional Christian community, I think, is something that's really important to beginning that. So, for someone who doesn't have the ability where they're at to try to be building a better world, trying to be restoring the social order, as the popes have talked about, I think that emphasis on building community has to come first. And that, means, I think proximity in a lot of ways. We all live so far from each other, just we're all like even our closest friends are sometimes a 15-minute drive away. It's really hard to have the simple serendipity of meeting people on the street or just having spontaneous meals or prayers or whatever else when we've all just been kind of dispersed by automobile society. And so I think one really key thing is, just establishing and committing to really intentional Christian communities, which can then become kind of hubs of, that action that we're talking about. And we could probably talk a long time on this topic because there's so much to discuss there. And I know there's a
That's
lot.
All right. We are resolutely opposed, adamantly against sound bites.
Certainly.
Say what you have to say.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, just things that I'd point to, to go with the flow of what do we do? I think being the way that Peter Marin, he kind of articulated a 3-step plan. And the first step for him was the clarification of thought, right? And so that was, for him having roundtable discussions. And, we do that. That's a common Catholic worker thing to have roundtables at a Catholic worker house. We do ours every Friday. But so many of us, just as Christians and all, we might know I'd say certainly I'm guessing among, the average practicing Catholic, they probably know the doctrines of the faith decently, like they know the Eucharist is body, blood, soul, and divinity. They know that Mary was immaculately conceived and stuff, and good thing. I'm glad they know that. But I think that the education of Catholics on Catholic social teaching and the sort of Catholic vision of society is woefully underappreciated, and just people often don't even recognize like the depth of that social teaching there. So I think for people who are, not really sure, like they're looking at the world around them and they're wondering what to do, I think just beginning to, read the encyclicals. And one thing, even if that's encyclicals is maybe a big ask because they can a goal of Tradistae, right? The reason that, I'm trying to provide these resources is to get people an introduction to that thought, just get some of the easy ideas out there. So, people getting into that vision of Catholic social teaching first. And then, beyond that, forming intentional communities, inspired by that vision, recognizing, how the world should be and everything, gathering together with fellow Christians, whether it's living in a household together, whether it's, living in a house next to each other, moving close to one's parish. We very intentionally started our Catholic worker house 3-minute walk from our parish here. Just really intentionally putting one's resources towards that communitarian type of life. And then from there, trying to build up those institutions and return to sort of a way of life that's ordered around those principles of Catholic social teaching. So that's, I think, maybe a broad kind of vision. And just in terms of something I'd love to recommend to any listeners is there's a great podcast by a friend of Tradistae called Happy Are You Poor? And it has a lot of great interviews with Christians who are involved in intentional communities, and definitely can serve as a great source of inspiration there.
I think maybe it's good to point out that when we talk about intentional communities, we're not talking about necessarily communistic communities. Mm-hmm. I knew of a community it was in Oregon at the time, and they had been Protestants who formed this community, and they held literally all things in common.
Yeah.
And he's telling me the difficulties of that kind of life, and the various different tensions. Go into the details, but most people are going to balk at that. And actually, Dom Rembert Sorg, I don't know if you're familiar with him. Dorothy Day was quite fond of his towards the theology of, or it's a Benedictine theology of manual labor, I think it's called.
I've heard of it, yeah.
It's well worth reading. But Dom Rembert Sorg points out, he says that private property is proper to families because private property is at the root of the notion of private property. Each person, the husband being the property of the wife being the property of the husband, is at the root of the marriage contract. So private property flows naturally. He says it's very different, however, for the religious life. And he actually proposed, if I remember correctly, that all priests live with a life, take a vow of poverty. Whether they're, religious house or not. But that's the thing. I mean, there are different kinds of communities, right? I mean, you could have a communist community in the small C sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say, I'm definitely, I think that, I'm very inspired by, that monastic life, which is a true commune, is communistic in that way. And the Bruderhof are a great example too of another community, not in the Catholic Church, but that does it in a really inspiring way. And I think that, we as lay people need to not necessarily, like you said, it's often not really appropriate or fitting for lay people to take on total poverty, but that same spirit of the evangelical councils, like Vatican II, is really clear that same spirit of the evangelical councils of chastity, poverty, obedience are supposed to infuse all Christians. Like, that's not something that we can leave to the religious, to monks and nuns, and say, oh, laity don't need to worry about that. We just raise our kids in a nice suburb and send them all off to the best colleges, but as long as they're like good Catholics, it's fine, right? Like, there's a real emphasis on we need to be living out the evangelical counsels, in our lives, and it's going to apply differently, but it does have to apply in reality. And so, I think, just having that detachment from wealth, which in our society is such a rare thing, right? And being willing to, maybe take a lower standard of living, a lower paying job, a lower, sort of class neighborhood, but a place that affords more virtue, more community, more opportunities to grow in the spirit together. I think that that's definitely something that is a real need for Christians, who are inspired to be living out the gospel. And I think what drew me to the Catholic worker movement ultimately was the fact that I saw that being done within the church, so beautifully by Dorothy and Peter. And their writings, their witness on that topic really inspired me. And, I very much hold that vision in mind. Dorothy, she used to dream that every Catholic church would have a Catholic worker house, every parish would have a Catholic worker house. And I think if more and more Christians, more and more Catholics committed themselves to those ideals, started living that out, then that's really a way in which we could begin to see the principles of Catholic social teaching begin to sort of infuse our society. And we could begin to organize really in that direction.
Here are 3 or 4 thoughts that connect with what you folks have been saying. Thought number 1 is later in the hour, we'll be talking directly about the American Solidarity Party. But it's noteworthy, I think, that though the party draws on a whole recognized group of intellectuals, none of them started the party. None of them started the party. The people that started the party and the people who keep the party going are, for the most part, not really intellectuals. I think the intellectuals drop in from time to time. And I think that people in the party who are active need to be close to the intellectuals. But the inception of the party, it wasn't the work of intellectuals by no stretch of the imagination. That's one thought. Another thought, and that first thought connects with your comments. Another thought that connects with your comments. The world today is such a god-awful, hopeless mess. I think Christopher cited last week or the week before, a priest that used to say after finishing lunch with the students, well, things are going to fall apart completely before they get any better.
You got to say just right. Things will get worse before they collapse.
Oh, see?
Yeah.
It's only a paraphrase. Well, now think of Dorothy and Peter. We had a great recession not so long ago. They were in a great depression. We have international tensions. What did they have? World War II. So difficult as our times are, in many ways, they're not really more difficult than the times that Peter and Dorothy worked in or began the movement in. And then on communities, I spent some time at the Chicago Catholic Worker and at the Detroit Catholic Worker, lots of comparing and contrasting. At the Chicago Catholic Worker, well, at the point that I was there was a fellow named Carl Meyer who ran it. I'm not sure if he's still alive. I used to know, but I've lost track in the past couple of years. Well, at any rate, Carl Meyer knew a lot of people that were interested in intentional community that were loosely based around the University of Chicago. And his claim was that the only communities that actually survive are communities of need. And the intentional communities that got launched by academic types around the University of Chicago tended to be dream communities, not communities of need. And any one of the people in the dream communities could pretty easily, after maybe just a couple more years of school, get a good paying job somewhere or another. They weren't real communities of need. Whereas Carl Meyer was intent on communities of need, and his own house was a community of need. And in terms of dramatic action, this was during the Vietnam War, and one day Carl up and leaves and he goes to Vietnam, get this, as a war correspondent for the Catholic Worker. and there's a major meeting of the legislature in Vietnam, and he unfolds a Catholic Worker banner and gets kicked out of the country. Wow. At any rate, he had a family at the same time. Now, that said, I think Dorothy very often said, you ought to be very, very careful about having any kind of a family in a Catholic worker house. Although, compare, contrast possibilities. In Detroit, a fellow named Lou Murphy and his wife, with 8 kids, had a really strong Catholic worker, and it was really engaged with civic affairs in Detroit. And now here's a segue to something I'd like you to explore, and you've mentioned it again already, Sean. They were closely connected with their parish, closely connected, did all sorts of things with the parish. And this was a point in Michigan where the labor union movement was very, very strong, and where civil rights things were just beginning to break, and where there was a real examination of the police force in the city of Detroit. That's how long those real examinations have been going on. And one Murphy or another was involved in all of those activities. So maybe you could say a little bit about your hopes for engagement with a parish, and maybe you could say a little bit about whether anybody in your community has kids yet, and what your plan is when you do have children of your own.
Certainly, yeah. No, there's a lot there. I'll mention first that I think that the something that a lot of people like to talk about is parish renewal. It's a common phrase. I think any priest or anyone who's like on parish council is definitely familiar with like parish renewal as a movement. And there's a grim reality to the facts on the ground of the Catholic Church in the United States that most parishes are on a sort of death spiral, to put it bluntly. In Pittsburgh, I forget the number, but there's something like well over half perhaps of the parishes closing. I mean, I know one popular priest podcaster is the pastor of a sort of parish network where they're closing down a bunch of parishes, and they have 7 parishes that are shutting down into just one. So that's just, maybe an extreme example, but I think that's common, and it's not just due to, the breakdown of like, the sort of immigrant ghettos of Catholics that existed in these cities, but it also just has a lot to do with the way that we've all transitioned to living life. There's no longer stable communities that exist around parishes. And so I think for people who are, interested in parish renewal, I think the conversation around intentional community has to go hand in hand with trying to not just like create a new program or XYZ at a parish, and even revamping a parish's liturgy. That can only do so much if you don't have that long-term commitment from families, even community around the parish. But you asked some questions about us personally, and I'd be happy to speak to that. We none of us at the house, no members of the house, have any children. We do have some single mothers who are here, not with any younglings, any young children, but some of them with children on the way. And really, I'd say that one thing that I think that within both the Catholic worker movement and intentional community generally, the solutions to problems are all very particular. Like there's not a one size fits all solution for how, every parish should do it, how, like what exactly should be done there. But I think that what is, one size fits all, what is a universal thing that I could, point to and recommend is the need for just commitment, for faith, hope, and love that comes with a real commitment to living out the gospel. And so having a real faith that community is possible, that living as brothers and sisters in Christ is possible, having a real hope that God will provide for one's needs, especially when one, maybe doesn't take the most comfortable path economically and makes choices that are going to build up community instead. Having real hope that God's going to bless that, and having real love and real charity, just the doing the works of mercy, praying together, living well with other members. It's in those things that the solutions are going to come out of. But to touch a little bit on the solutions, I think nobody has to make this up on their own. I know that our vision of intentional community has been really inspired by other people who have been doing this for a long time. We have a lot of friends in the Bruderhof, and so we've been in touch with them, and definitely read a lot of they have some great resources on community life. We've reached out to people who are living in community already, and just ask questions of, hey, what's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? I mentioned the Happy Are You Poor podcast, and that's again got some great resources there. So once you have people who are committed, once you have even just 2 or 3 people, that's how we started. Just myself, my at the time fiance, and one other friend who was a longtime Catholic worker started the house, and now we have 10 housemates, across 2 houses. And then that's including guests as well and everything. But, once you find a small group of people, at a parish or wherever else who are committed, who are praying together, discerning together, reading, resources, inspiring them of, what Christian life can be like and what models have worked in intentional community, then figuring out how to live that on the ground in any particular parish. There's so many different models that one can take, whether one's in an urban parish, a rural parish, whether one wants to sort of start, say, a Catholic worker house, or maybe, like a third order kind of group, or all sorts of different things. But yeah, I'd say that, there's many models out there, but the universal thing has to be that, just that concrete commitment, and then learning from others who have already made that commitment.
So important. Yeah, Christopher.
Would you have any suggestions? I mean, you talk about maybe people moving close together, but many times it's not an option for a lot of people for various different reasons. How to form community at a distance? Is that possible? Have you seen models of that? I mean, I'm not talking about internet distance where you have to get on the internet. I'm talking about, within 30-minute radiuses or something like that. Have you seen it like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, there are models of that, of people who, I mean, I see it, for example, in certain Latin Mass communities where people will drive a good distance, because they're very committed to it, and they'll go a good distance and they'll meet up there. And homeschooling, definitely. I've seen, my wife comes from a born and raised kind of traditionalist family. And so, I've definitely seen some tight networks of community there where people are committed to homeschooling together, to liturgy together, and going to that. But, I gotta say, even seeing those sorts of communities and everything, I think ultimately I'm very disillusioned about the potentiality of any kind of community life that isn't returning to the more local. And by local, I don't just mean, within a county, but, within a real community where people can walk to each other's houses and such. Because, just the, like, for example, I work with Amish, I commute and work with an Amish construction company. And what has really saved the Amish from the breakdown that you see everywhere else in the world is the fact that they don't have cars. Cars are banned. None of them can drive. None of them have driver's licenses. And they all live within walking distance of their church. They live in these small communities of, you have maybe 20 or 30 families in a church, and, they can all walk there, or take a very short buggy ride there. And that model of life is something that we've really departed from in our just very industrial consumerist society. And I don't really see, there are things that have helped, like by all means, we're using Zoom right now. I use all sorts of group chats and stuff to communicate with people. But I see all of those things as just kind of palliatives, just sort of pain relievers on a society that is deeply atomized, deeply alienated, and that, we should use those tools, to help and to try to build something better. But ultimately, I think that we're going to have to make commitments to a way of life that is radical, that is radically different than the one we're living, if we're going to both be rejecting the lies and errors and temptations of our current society, and also trying to build a new society in the shell of the old. That's a phrase Peter loved to use. And I think that, going back to the early Christians, in the Roman Empire, like, they recognized that the empire was evil. It was based around, the worship of demons, and that it wasn't something that they could really feel at home in. And so they began to forge an alternative way of life. Some people call this the Benedict option, and whether you feel like that's a good way of talking about it or not, I think we should really be looking to the early Christians, because they lived radically. They made very radical commitments. They refused to participate in certain elements of the Roman ruling order that everyone else thought was perfectly normal. And that's how they converted society. And when the empire fell, they were ready. Like, they were ready to sort of leap into action and begin the construction of Christendom. And I think until we begin to build this new society in the crumbling shell of the old one, when that crumbling shell collapses, we're not going to be ready to build a new Christendom if we aren't already living out that way of life.
To play the devil's advocate, if I may.
Sure.
A role easily assumed.
You bring up the early Christians, and I remember the Epistle of Diognetus, where he talks about, he says, paraphrase, we're really not any different from any of the rest of you folks. We dress like you do. We live the way you do. Christians were slaves. Christians were slaveholders. You think of the book of Philemon, right? They didn't really, for the most part, in the early centuries, there wasn't a radical. They got together for the sacraments, for prayer, but they didn't really necessarily live any radically different way. They didn't live in communal groups, but they seemed, for the most part, to live like everybody else did around them. But yet, they were able to transform society. So it would seem that the whole commitment to a radical life can really occur within structures that are already existing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think there's an important tension there. There's a way of looking at the early Christian church, that sees it as, sort of totally radical, totally opposed. And then, there's sort of a way that sees it as, gently sort of working its way, like a Christian spirit working its way into the Roman Empire. And I think something that, from the point of view of 2,000 years of Christianity, we have a certain clarity in that we can kind of see the, just certain distinctions that weren't available to the early Christians. So I'll make just a few of those. And one thing that I would want to mention first is that you mentioned that the Christians didn't live in it like really intentionally communal life. And I'd push back on that actually and say that back in pre-modern society, even in Roman society, because there wasn't the same, technological, industrial, capitalist system that we have today, community was a sort of natural thing. Like even the Romans, they didn't have cars, you know what I mean? Like they lived within walking distance. They lived in sort of estates and modes of life that were still fundamentally traditional in some way. Even if Rome was obviously infused with paganism, even in pagan traditional societies, there was still a level of community, of a natural relationship to the land, and of certain rhythms of life that were natural. And something that the popes often say, especially Pope Leo and such, he says that in modern society and under liberalism, and capitalism, we've dreamed up things that the pagans themselves would not have dreamed of. We've imagined a society in which marriage doesn't exist. We've imagined a society, in which the state has no reference to God. We've done all of these things that even for the pagans would have been a step too far. And one of the things that I would point to is that we've built a society where individualism isn't just an idea, but it's a lived reality. Like we live, many, many people live as individuals, even within like nuclear families. One person, goes to their own sort of events. They have their own friends, their own community. Everyone does a different thing. Everyone listens to a different sort of music, has their own culture, eats different food. Like we've created a life in which people can live as radical individuals, even within a family structure. There isn't even that like those shared rhythms of life that came from sharing work, sharing food, sharing culture. With all of these sort of modern technocratic innovations, we've destroyed all that. So that's something that I would point to. If we want to convert people, if we want to convert society, we know that grace builds on nature. So we need to restore a level of, even within our own lives, a level of that natural life so that grace has something more full to build upon. Liberal society has largely even hollowed out the natural. So that's one point I would point to. But then on whether the early Christians are radical, like it's true that the early Christians, pointed out that, in certain of their apologies that they made to the Roman empires, we're not that different than you. They would say, we're in fact more law abiding. We're more, better citizens than other Romans are. And part of that was, you see that in the apologetic literature because it's trying to make a defense, like it's trying to say, hey, don't persecute us. Like, hey, let us, practice our religion. So there's that element. But there's also a kind of subversive argument even in that, because what they're saying often, is that, they live out more fully. Like, Christianity doesn't have to reject nature, so they're living out the sort of society of the Romans better than they are, recognizing that Roman society is based on these errors, these false ways of living, and that Christianity purges those and actually lives them out better. And so, the things like there's a reason they were persecuted. It's not that it wasn't for nothing that they did that. It's because they refused to throw incense to the gods. They refused to sort of order their lives in the way that the Romans felt was just so obvious and natural. And I think similarly, we have to refuse to pinch incense to the gods, to the gods of modernity. We have to refuse to sort of live the way that modern society does. And if we're not doing that in a way that provokes persecution, if we're not doing that in a way that provokes difficulty, if we're not taking up our cross daily, then are we really conforming to the gospel? And then maybe just a last point that I'd point out is that in the early church, there wasn't as clear distinction between the laity and the clergy and the religious, right? We have that now. We have a sort of clear distinction there. So we recognize these different roles that they all have. But beautifully with Vatican II, we recognize that each of those roles, like something in the Middle Ages that got kind of hazy was the fact that, it kind of got assumed sometimes that, the clergy and the religious could live out the fullness of the gospel and the laity could just kind of, work and live as like, normal society did. And if they wanted to get really religious, they could go join one of those. That's maybe a caricature, but, there's something to that. Whereas Vatican II has really emphasized, no, like we need to all live out the precepts of the gospel. They apply to all of us. And so living out that life should be like, I mean, we should also be striving to be saints. And if our lives don't look, as radical as the hagiographies that we read of the early Christians in Rome, then I think we have to question, are we, how could we be living out the faith more radically? How could we be giving ourselves more completely to the gospel? So that's a mouthful. I don't feel like that was the best way of answering your question. So sorry if I'm rambling there, but maybe you can give me a counterpoint to one of those.
Well, let me ramble right back at you.
Sure.
Begin with a particular and a graphic particular and a particular graphically mentioned by you just now. There used to be a favorite poster at the Catholic Worker in New York. Mm-hmm. And I suppose the artistic genre would be under socialist realism or something like that. But the statement across the base of the poster was not one pinch of incense. And it had a martyr refusing to add that pinch of incense. And I think that that's a crucial element of Catholic life, of witness, of the martyr, not one pinch of incense. There's a lot of proportionalist moral theology that would really leave us with the suggestion that a lot of those martyrs were really dumb. They could have faked it. Why didn't they just fake it for a while? And then they could go on and do a lot of good things. What was their problem? So I think that's extremely important. And also, you speak of history. Well, one local kind of Catholic history that's accessible and easy to read are the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch as he's brought down to Rome to be murdered. And they, in a very succinct way, describe the kinds of offices in the church, in the very early church, the very distinctive offices, and the liturgy in the very early church. And you're looking for something that's short enough to read one epistle a day of Ignatius of Antioch, and you have an introduction to patristics that will do you much good. Now, in terms of appealing to history, we got two basic tendencies. I think a contemporary tendency is really exemplified by somebody like Michel Foucault. Give him 4 or 5 centuries and he'll give you an analysis of it in terms of radical discontinuities. Radical discontinuities. That's the way to understand history. I would reject that. I think there are definite movements that are identifiable and distinguishable within history. At the same time, I think when we look at history, we have to acknowledge its chiaroscuro. It's light, dark mixes. You mentioned Leo XIII and what he said not even the pagans would do. Here's something of note, historically speaking. The only writer, classical writer, in Latin that even bothered to mention in order to reject the gladiatorial games was Seneca. Seneca, a slave. If you look, say, at Cicero, you could look and look and look. You can read the 1,000 letters he wrote to friends, and there's never a single bad word said about the gladiatorial games, in which tens of thousands of animals were slaughtered for entertainment, and thousands of Christians were slaughtered for entertainment. Seneca, who was something of a Stoic, in one of his letters says, well, I had a kind of an easy day in mind for today. And so, I knew that there'd be a crowd at the Colosseum. I went over there and worse than usual. Maybe in order to get a good audience around noon when I went, everybody was fighting naked. That way the fights would be shorter and the people watching could see a lot more blood. And this is from Seneca, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, this is not like kickboxing. This is like something that we wouldn't imagine going to see. And so there you have that. So there's light and dark all through history. And in terms of trying to see how history works and doesn't work, I think there's a wonderful section in John Henry Newman's Towards a Grammar of Assent, where he talks about how a whole lot of our knowledge is not deductive. A whole lot of our knowledge is bringing together streams of thought. And he says, you want an example? Here are 3 authors, and they have wonderful things to say about the fall of the Roman Empire, and they're not compatible. And all 3 of these authors use fundamentally the same sources and present extremely interesting arguments, and their conclusions are not compatible. So when we start to talk about history, then we have to talk about the philosophy of history, and right away we're into some mind-expanding territories. So I mentioned that as a ramble to counter your ramble. And we don't have very much time left, and I'd like to have at least 5 minutes, if you folks are still up for it, to get your take on the American Solidarity Party.
Sure.
You said in an email that any friend of the American Solidarity Party was a friend of yours. All right, why this warm embrace?
Sure, yeah. No, I'm glad we get to it, and I think I'll put a caveat that one thing that Dorothy was famously not very interested in electoral politics and everything. It's definitely a mixed question within the Catholic worker movement. There's various sort of strains of thought. I think one thing personally that I see as really important is that, and something I've seen Pope Francis, actually, he has some really good writings on in a few audiences with popular movements, is the need to have both the sort of local and the universal. Both of them are necessary, right? Like there's the church is the church of both ands, not either or. And so there's a need for intentional community. Absolutely. There's a need to be building up parishes to focus on the local, to do that. But at the same time, I recognize that there's a lot of pressures. There's a lot of, economic pressures, political pressures and stuff that make it hard to build up community. It's because of our sort of insane healthcare system and so many other things. It can be very hard for people to get by, to have what they need to build up those communities in the first place. And we also have an obligation, right, to struggle for people who aren't necessarily in our local area, and to struggle for the unborn, for the immigrant, for the poor, for et cetera. And so, we need to have a recognition that if we focus just on sort of building up, serving the poor locally, doing the works of mercy, building up intentional community, which we should do all of that. But if we focus only on that and don't engage in the bigger political struggle, that's not, we are, I think, in some ways shirking a certain obligation we have, as the laity, especially, are called to perfect the temporal order. And so that's something that we need to be doing. But if we focus all our energy on that sort of politics, if we're constantly posting online or making arguments, or just always getting involved in, activism that's just kind of scattered and breathless and always chasing the latest in national politics, that's a recipe for burnout, and it's a recipe for failure. You know what I mean? What has made most social movements successful, most sort of popular radical social movements, is having a sort of wide base of people that you engage and activate as part of that movement. Not just kind of, individual, petitions and things from just a bunch of really isolated individuals. And so I see the ASP as taking a role in that more broad, universal political aspect. I'm involved in the ASP. I vote for them. I see them as, I put no hope in our sort of duopoly political parties, the Republicans and Democrats. I'm really uninterested in, the sort of mainstream elements of those parties. And so, yeah, we need real political alternatives that are actually committed to principles that align with Catholic social teaching, and that are imagining politics in a different way, that are focused on, actually dealing with the problems of the modern age and not just getting caught up in the culture wars and other sorts of just really useless bickering over these sort of symbols and the mainstream news cycle, when the real political fights lie totally elsewhere. And so I'd say that's a great summary. For people not familiar, I bet it seems like your audience is a lot of solidarians. They would have to be. I know that both of you are involved with the Solidarity Party, but
not to mention Mario Ramos Reyes, who's not here with us today. He's another one.
Okay. Yes. Wonderful. Yeah. No. I mean, I think the party's great. I think everyone should get involved, and I think, those two things are poles of a united kind of whole. Building up intentional community, start a Catholic worker house in every parish, and you have an ASP chapter out of every Catholic worker house at every parish. There you go, and that's a recipe for success.
That sounds like a Catholic vision.
Yeah, now that you say
all
it.
Right. And it begins with the gospel, and we always end with the gospel for the day. And it's the choosing of the apostles, Luke's account. Jesus departed to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. When day came, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called a zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a stretch of level ground. A great crowd of his disciples and a large number of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon came to hear him and be healed of their diseases. And even those who were tormented by unclean spirits were cured. Everyone in the crowd sought to touch him, because power came forth from him and healed them all. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thanks so much for having me on this.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.